You are listening to the Worlding Podcast, where we explore the relationship of how we are both shaping and being shaped by our surroundings. The podcast traces interconnections by inviting each episode's guest to pass on the mic to someone who has influenced their world. And now, here's your host, dance artist Renae Shadler.
Hello friends. Today we begin our 8th string figure with my guest, Jacob Hühn, a Berlin-born and raised shapeshifter currently dedicated to enabling the project Moos Berlin, which means Moss in German, and an international residency and co-living community and event space within the framework of this building, which is nested next to Treptow Park. Today we're going to focus on community building and facilitation and how this is always connected to the more than human, whether that be the architecture of the building, the weather, or the people present. Thanks so much for chatting with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a big inspiration already having this pre-conversations with you.
Actually, to share with listeners, one of these pre-conversations was around a week ago, and we met at Treptow Park, so a few minutes walk from Moos. And as we were talking, I placed down my jacket on the grass, and a swarm of ants came and nested in my jacket. So when I went to leave, I was kind of taking all these creatures with me, and there was really this flurry of activity. But within this chaos, I had the feeling that every ant knew what it was doing and why. And we laughed about how Moos also has this almost contagious energy that when you're around the building or connecting with the community online, that things are possible. How is it being at the center of that, Jacob, living at the Moos and also facilitating the encounter with artists?
Yeah, like co-living brings in its own intensity, and co-living and co-working in the same time, or like being in a residency that still needs to build its own structures while already operating, was bringing a lot of challenges. Maybe it's like a relationship that challenges you and brings out all these things. Maybe like a mirror cabinet, like. It's for sure it has challenges for everyone, and so needs to have both like a willingness and an openness to be shaping and to be shaped by each other's personalities and projects.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very inspiring group of people that are kind of gathering around the building, but also the building itself I find very interesting. For people that don't know it, it's an old bathtub factory for bathtubs that could swing. So it has a huge 8-meter high ceiling in the hall, which is an event space on the ground level. And then there are 3 stories of apartments where artists can live and work. And then on top of that, there's a beautiful sun terrace. So within Berlin, you know, we all know about these utopic stories of found spaces and repurposed artist buildings, but there are some left, even in the early 2020s. And how do you find being in this amazing architecture and enabling things to happen there? Is it in dialogue with your projects at the moment?
I would say like the space is giving you homeworks, or like is calling for a certain kind of use of the space, and sometimes challenging you. So there's different spaces in this old warehouse, and they have their own way. Some of the architecture is asking for. It's really asking for being a community space and for holding community within the setting of a home, and that's a really interesting kind of starting point that we had when we moved in there 2 years ago. And how can you invite people for events into your home and run some kind of like a center from there. And the very new residency space has a challenge in itself because it's so full of light, and the architecture is quite like a labyrinth, and definitely so designed that people, the residency moved into the space anew when there was no furniture, and so part of the residency was also building their own beds, and I totally loved the blank slate of the invitation of having no furniture and like actually just bringing in what was needed. But in the same time, residents came together from really different walks of life. There was 22-year-old Ukrainian refugees that were having a co-living for activists in Ukraine, and there was like people way older and like with a different kind of need for cleanliness and so on, and in this kind of finding a common ground of how to live together. And I think that's why it's working also for the short-term perspective, because not everybody would be up for like such a long-term community space, or would you?
Yeah, I really love the energy of being on residencies. I think they create a certain push. I know as an artist, I often work on 2-week residencies, or I had one in Montreal for 3 months. So I think because of the short-term nature, they create a certain drive. Like the one I was at recently in Lake Studios in Berlin, there was an artist there from Spain that would stay in the studio till like 1 a.m. in the morning because she doesn't have access to this massive studio when she's at home. So there was a different energy of, I guess, like a threshold of the drive or ambition to discover something new that isn't sustainable long term. So this I really love about energy, the freshness and the encounter and the being in a new space. In terms of the project becoming the space, I find very interesting as a proposition. I think right now I'm very focused on worlding and certain things within my choreographic practice, which is something that is hard to put in parallel with a communal living situation, because in a way that becomes the project. From what I hear and what I've experienced in these short residencies is it's all consuming. So I can definitely understand the short term allows for a different type of temporality. Whereas I know at Moos there's also people living there long term, but they're a little bit separated from the short term residents. So I can imagine this also provides some distance from the project in some way, because you're living there at the moment, aren't you, Jacob, upstairs in the warehouse space?
Yeah, and to just give an orientation, like residencies, some take a month and some take 9 months. And so far, because we're still kind of figuring out the residency by running the residency in its first version or so, I was curious around letting some kind of natural factor exist, and then kind of people would kind of come with their projects, and there would be maybe like a natural kind of integrating into the space and also going out. And so far nobody is kind of like ready to go out, because everybody is still in there, and so we're just kind of extend in this ways. But there's certain limits to the, like, it's not a long-term scenario, it's more like a midterm testing ground of being together and inspiring the place that definitely needs like some kind of inspiration and energy, because the people that live there long term are mostly kind of families and and have kids and have less energy to actively shape this setting.
And how is also the neighbourhood? Because I know that was one of your big interests in rooting down into Moors, was that you would have kind of a regular space that community could come to and that you could create relations with people living in the area, so it became more local. And now having international residencies come in and international artists bringing inspiration from outside of the local, how have those two kind of landscapes connected? Are the locals inspired by the international artists, or have there been some crossovers there?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, this is more of an kind of a longer term ambition still to really root in the local. So whereas the residency, as I was saying, people were or are kind of arising in a place that is not fully furnished, full of furniture yet, and still building its own rituals even and structures of caretaking for each other. Sometimes the residency is still kind of busy with itself, whereas the overall project is totally dependent also on the goodwill of the neighbors. The new event space can only work kind of if neighborhood is also approving it in some way. And so we had like tensions around noise. I think it's a typical Berlin scenario that really brings you on the table with the neighbors, and maybe to go back to this kind of ambition that we were having. Like, one was, of course, like rooting and seeing what it makes for you to actually root into a place. And the other thing also was like getting less abstract and like coming out of our own bubbles and sometimes breaking down our language in simple ways and making the innovations that we kind of found ourselves in, like trying to make it really practical for young and old. And this is a long-term ambition that this cultural center space can open and invite the neighborhood into that, and that residencies can use this open space to bring in their projects. But so far, sometimes we're still behind walls, or where people can come in, but also like we still exist in our own boundaries.
It reminds me actually of one of my favorite residencies that I participated in was in Iceland, and it was on a peninsula in a town of 160 people, so very remote. And it was directed by a theatre director who'd bought a fishing factory that was no longer used, and half of the space was a hostel for tourists, and half of the space was kind of the old cool room and kind of processing area for the fish was two small theatres. So one was actually called the cool room theatre and one was the kind of fish theatre. And it was so nice because exactly what you're talking about was happening. People were coming on their family holiday and they kind of end up in this artistic hostel, which is very cool, of course, because there are artists there doing interesting things. And we could each night try out new ideas or offer a walking tour. I think I did a walking tour of the area, knowing nothing about the area, like an imaginative walking tour. So there was that crossover that actually doesn't happen very often. So I think that's really beautiful, and it does give a lot to the artistic practice also, that things kind of move outwards and you create different associations. It's really quite enjoyable.
Yeah, I like this story, and it's really like, one thing is like how do you root in a place and like get familiar with the history and like yeah, the modern human world of the space, and all this kind of takes time. And then how do you like bring yourself, your own ideas in on this kind of ground of listening first. And and for me there was like sometimes this question. We had some guests from a school that stayed 10 weeks with us, just spending 10 weeks of sensing the ecosystem, and could never really start to bring in their projects because they were always understanding more and more and more and more. And yeah, kind of finding this balance that you can bring in as a short-term guests your ideas and your practices or interventions in a way that can echo in the space.
Yeah, and that new forms are created. I really appreciate that also, like the example of being at this residency in Iceland. Like I never would have created a tourism event, but given that it was a hostel and there were tourists there, I thought like, oh wow, what does this space call for actually? And so I think that's really nice if there can be this connection between the community that's there, what the space holds, like you said, this incredible factory situation with these big concrete poles in the event space. They also call for something quite massive, I feel. Like there is something quite epic about that space. So the fact it is a larger hall that can be shared between different projects that then inevitably begin to talk to one another and have a conversation is very interesting.
Yeah, it's like it's calling for quite specific, site-specific interventions in many ways. And I feel like the general invitation for people, like what can you bring in some kind of urban village, and how can then our place as some kind of very different picture of how life in the city can look like also inspire other neighborhoods to to live a less boring reality. And of course this is something where we are super privileged to have, like in this sold out city, such a agency to shape our living scenario. Yeah, I was curious into this question of like how can the neighborhood look like that really inspires you? And I just wanted to ask you this question because I was very curious into your imagination of how a neighborhood and how the relational practices between people in a co-living container can also take place. So yeah, you feel my question?
I feel your question. We're co-communicating. I like it a lot. Yeah, I really appreciate what you said about listening first. I think that's something that is hard to practice. Like when you come with an agenda, how flexible can your agenda be? People that come with certain deadlines, if they have a work deadline of working 9 to 5 for a company, or if they have a lifestyle deadline of taking a child to kindergarten at 3 o'clock, how within those structures can we find breathing space which enable interconnection with one another? And how can we think outside of those parameters of, okay, it's your child, so you're taking them to Kita, but actually can somebody else be available to take them to the kindergarten? And then allowing people within that space not to determine what's expected. I think that's a big thing for me in co-living experiences, which have only ever been short-term. So I have a very different experience than you, Jacob. Like it's always been with this end point in sight. But it was often for me this kind of expectation that this idea of caring or generosity came with a hidden, so that should be 10 hours a week, or that should be amounted maybe to what the rent would be, which would be this. So there was always this calculation, which I think takes a lot of time to release ourselves from, and often radical action. Someone just saying, it's fine for me to clean. I don't mind cleaning. That's definitely my way of contributing. I love to clean. I love to potter. It's like a choreography with my hands, and it calms my nervous system. I think I've mentioned it on the podcast. So this is wonderful for me. Wiping down surfaces, moving my hands, creating my little dance. But often, other people will think, oh, you're cleaning a lot, I'm so sorry, or that means something. That means an expectation hasn't been met. So it really takes this offer of, no, this just comes. This is an enjoyment. So I find that very interesting as a choreography within the co-living. It really is a dance.
I perceive myself a lot with the kind of like having stronger expectations for people to contribute more actively, and so this is my own challenge in some ways, and I always love the contributions being born out of the people just naturally, and mostly it's like one contribution inspires someone else to contribute in another way. And it's not really to push the spiral so much, but more to, even just open this questions. And sometimes these questions need to be answered collectively, of how can we be in service here. And for sure, the residency has some kind of identity of giving something to the place, because people are invited to pay their rent in a basic income community currency experiment, which frees people to suggest a contribution. And because these contributions can happen on so many different kind of levels, can be the care for the community, can be the care for the place, can be the care for the neighborhood, can be the energy for certain kind of creative projects, can be the support for other people in their projects. So far, we haven't been really kind of defining expectations, and it's and I think sometimes it's a bit tricky because it can go in both directions. Like, people cannot only inspire each other to support more; they can also lean back all more in the same time, and in this way, it's. I think I was just reminded on my own kind of thing of, do I love what I'm doing here, and do I love of giving what I can give in there? And I've been really like enjoying to be surrounded by people that come up with some kind of projects to make a space more creative or sustainable or socially active.
I also just want to linger a little bit on this idea of making a life less boring, or making something more creative. I think there is also that trap sometimes of doing more, but sometimes maybe the creativity sits within an internal place. I know my partner, for example, he loves just hanging out on the couch, and I do it with him for like maybe 20 minutes, and then I'm like, okay, we can meditate, or we could go for a walk, or we could cook, but this just like hanging on the couch, what's happening? Like, for me, that isn't incredibly creative, but for him, it's a really rich experience. So I think that's also something within these co-living lifestyles or shared spaces. Also, there's this acknowledgement that everybody's idea of boring or creative is very different. And that also creates a richness and experience when you can watch someone chilling on a couch and think, wow, they're watching the theatre performance of their life right now. Or,
Yeah,
or that is a Matisse painting being created as we speak.
yeah. I feel like we had some people that was their contribution of just being so slow in their way, um, and this thing of like this is a project in the living. So like for many people, this was like a really weird dynamic as well of home, being separated from work, and or like home being part of the it's a it brings me a bit into also like the score that I brought to this episode as like a reminder for myself to not have intentions and have the space of just not focusing. And I feel like this conversations with you also have been really also reflecting my own process of the busyness with the ends in this image. And yeah, I mean, ends are for me like the symbol of like so much activity.
It's true, they're always busy.
and I wonder how they where their kind of relaxation is happening in the business, or yeah.
I would love to hear the score. For people that aren't following the podcast regularly, a score is kind of a way of sharing, almost like a recipe, a proposition for you to have an experience, an embodied experience. There are also musical scores that musicians write on paper for people to play. And Jacob and I were talking about a way that we could share his research and experience in the Moos community with us to embody. So I would love to hear it and practice it as well, if you can talk me through, and listeners.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much it translates my practice, but it's something that is a very precious memory for me, because it's one of my first, kind of early life experiences that I remember being in a being with the kindergarten, traveling away for something that felt like 2 weeks, and I was lying under the bed, having my first experiences with this game that I'm going to share in a second, as a way of maybe dealing with the longing for my parents, or for home, or so on as well. Yeah, the invitation to you listening is maybe to take a seat, or lie down and close your eyes. And while you're closing your eyes, you take your fists and you start to put a gentle pressure on your eyes. And after a while of pushing on your eyes, starts to come these patterns and movements of light, and you can play a bit with your hands to the sides or up and down, and you can look in or look back and see if you can kind of enter in the spaces. And then you can release your hands and come back to space. And in the first moments, yeah, there's another light with which you see the space around you.
I just make my way back to the microphone from sitting on the floor next to my desk. And I don't often sit on the floor next to my desk. And it's actually very comforting.
Yeah, I was thinking how this also fits with our situation here, because we're just listening to each other over the headphones. We don't see each other, and coming from the sense of listening just into this seeing, but seeing in the dark spaces, and trying if we can enter there, or if some kind of visions can come. Maybe if it's, for me, it's also like different things happening at different times. I try this.
For me, it also resonates with our conversation in terms of your role within Moos, which we haven't really touched on yet. Because I feel like through our conversation and imaginary seeing, I have the image of the building and the people frequenting it, but I'm also very curious about where you sit within that. I mentioned earlier that you're living in the warehouse next to the residency centre and event space. How are your days led at the moment, and how do you see yourself within the project?
Yeah, I'm in a super critical role that I find myself in, which is, yeah, where I'm still also like needing to reflect a lot, and also like needing to kind of change things. I came here with this strong drive to kind of build a community around here, and to like not especially kind of develop projects, but link projects to the space, and see how the different communities can be mobilized to come together, how the space can build bridges to other spaces in the city, and so on. And it's not really that everyone else had this kind of need or drive or energy to do that. And so this is one thing. And then for sure, like residents get invited into a certain framework, into a certain thing. And there's a lot of like, I feel that's why the image that you were giving me again and again with this picture of the ants is also like an invitation for me to kind of sometimes step out of the way, and letting some kind of swarm intelligence mobilize around it. And this is a very tricky balance where I can get maybe even confused.
I can also definitely understand, because from our conversations, you're holding the keys of the space. You've signed a lease for the residency centre and the event space. And if somebody needs to use the hall, they contact you. And while people are suggesting residents to come, I feel like, from what I understand, that decision still lies with you in the way a director of a space would have that role. So I think that's also very interesting to challenge that, actually. But takes a lot of trust, and when something's just being built, because we mentioned to listeners that there were the 2 years of inviting and hosting events in the warehouse space next to the residency space and event centre. But now this residency space has only opened recently, within the last 2 months. So I can understand also when something is new and there are a lot of questions, that this role also gets reinforced even more so when people have different experience with the space.
Yeah, something that came up from the conversation with you as a choreographer, like bringing me in conversation. Sometimes I was, liking this image uh, of seeing this placemaking as an art, seeing the interaction of these people here as an art project. So in this way, I could have some kind of individual artistic way, but they're like, if it's groups and if it's like so much more as like lifelines of people, like in some ways there's a simple practice for me is really just looking what people want to do, what they dream of, what they can imagine doing themselves in the framework of here, seeing how they can be invited into bringing their inspiration into this framework from here, and kind of taking from there. But like the whole questions of how do certain kind of groups take also the responsibilities and start organizing places. I feel this is a process where we're just getting into as well. And so another image that I really liked always as a young creative myself was this image of an orchestrator that was like doing the concert, and there's something so playful in inviting other people to interact, but the way of the orchestration, the elegance of an orchestrator is definitely something where I don't even think like we are the kind of the orchestrators. The orchestration is somewhere else above us, and it's not like, it's kind of like an illusion to step into this role or idea of orchestrating something, because there is around places and around groups, there is certain kind of maybe like strong memes that they can give themselves to, or like certain kind of practices and so on. But they how people come together, and how there is an invisible orchestration in some way, and that's why even the residency program is it's been very open for the serendipity of people just being recommended, or people just ending up there, and it was not only like artists with their projects coming into there, but it was also like just someone who just came in there, and in this diffuse way of holding the things. I mean, even my my own way of describing my role sometimes sounds really weird or dangerous, or and so like I appreciate the space also of reflecting that, and also of being provoked in there. And
yeah, absolutely. I think also this idea of choreography, like organizing things or placing movements in relation to each other, is also an old-fashioned way of thinking about choreography. It's almost like now, also within this framework of worlding and shaping and being shaped, it's also about allowing relations to move and be moved by one another. So in that way, I see your role as a choreographer in this holding space and allowing things to enter and being open for things to enter. And this I think is really beautiful. It's almost like this traditional role of director is being shaped, but I also feel the trust in that and the responsibility. If we take this idea of Donna Haraway, which is talked about before in the podcast, of the ability to respond rather than the weight of needing to do something because you have the keys or you're responsible for a contract, but actually you have an ability to respond from this place of giving, which we've spoken about already, then it's really quite open. And I think that's the magic of also following your journey over the next few years with this space. Like, how will the short-term residents inform it and leave traces? I haven't also mentioned yet, but Moos has an amazing Telegram group of over 400 artists and thinkers, and there's always a dialogue of workshops and shared practices and people reaching out and also being quite vulnerable in things they're finding difficult in the world at the moment, or things that are, they just not even to ask for something, just to have a space to share. And I find that also a kind of digital sphere that moves outside of the physical building. So yeah, I feel the resonances and that they're coming from the edges of Treptower Park into the city, and vice versa, that the city is also being invited in with open doors in that way.
Yeah, I'm grateful, like the invitation to open and let come for the cultural space, or for the cultural space. I mean, even the kind of the encounter space, for the event space. This is a very strong kind of proposition, and it's like connecting to the struggles where there's like so many people just don't have spaces. And what just happened, what can kind of, if spaces are just there and kind of things can unfold, or if spaces have certain kind of dynamics around them, and what happens if certain kind of tonalities kind of build boundaries around the spaces, or things stay too much in a kind of a friends between friends zone.
Yeah, creating access points. I think that's really important. I have one last question, actually, in relation to what you said earlier about people coming and not needing to work or be reliant on work. Can you talk a little bit about how the residency is operating with different currencies?
We do have the traditional euro currency for food, where people pay their food in a shared kind of setting in euro. But for the rent, we have another currency that is called circles, and it's a digital UBI experiment. And UBI stands for Universal Basic Income. Sometimes I was thinking it would stand for Unconditional Basic Income, which makes kind of sense for me in the narrative that we don't have necessarily to be in this frequency of survival, and a lot of things kind of just, a lot of creative impulses are just coming once the survival energy is kind of satisfied. And so in such a collaborative ecosystem of co-living and learning from each other and maybe supporting one another, it was really important to not have people in the setting that they need to make a living and kind of do collaborations on top of that. And so with the support of the Circles project, residents can pay their rent in in this digital currency that they just receive by signing up and by asking friends and supporters, similar to a Patreon style support, to send them their circles for their residency. And of course, residents are always also invited to bring in offers and sharings into the marketplace that is in these other currency, which just connects people that want to think differently around money, maybe making collective community agreements of how they organize their economy. And rather than like working with the big established partners, bringing a lot of more smaller projects into this ecosystem of people, and exchanging their goods in another circle, in another currency. And like many experiments, the circles experiment also really works if just a lot of people say, okay, we just go in, we all step into the same kind of invitation in the same time. And because you trust this and because I trust that, from this container of the trust, we can collectively step in there.
Yeah, I've recently been working with Isaac Ebeneko from Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, and he's the creative director of a dance company and artistic organization, and it's called Asideva, which is Arts for Social and Economic Development in Africa. And this really brought up this conversation of actually to create creative experiences and share ideas through art is not enough. Like actually the economic development also is part of the expression. So I really appreciate that that's also happening here in Berlin, and that people are being invited to experiment on both levels, because they are so interconnected. And I think often they're separated as something is outside of the economy, but in reality there's a very small portion of people that experience art in that way. So yeah, great to know that the experiments continue on all levels.
I'm shouting out to this big inspiration of mine, Caroline Woolard, who's someone as an artist was doing so much around art and economy and experiments in there. And yeah, I think everyone interested can have a look at her work at arts.coop, where she compiled all the resources around artistic projects working with economic experiments. And I think the example you just gave is what kind of inspires you in there, or where you can feel like such a radical way of working as a group with money kind of creates a different dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely. Great questions to sit with, I think, over time and implement in different ways with different temporalities, like 1-year projects, 5-year projects, short-term projects. It's very provocative. As part of this podcast, I'm inviting you to pass on the mic to someone to talk to next. Caroline would be amazing, but I believe somebody else has been lined up. Who would you like us to talk to next, Jacob?
Yeah, I'm nominating Ivan March, and I'm not going to tell much except that he's really fun and really inspiring as well. Like you, Renae, and thank you for your careful, curious, considerate conversation skills.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed our conversation, and the rethinking around co-living and economy. Thank you so much. I hope to come to Moos soon. And actually, before we leave, for listeners, if you've been inspired by this podcast and you'd also like to visit Moos, or you're outside of Berlin and listening from America or Australia, or other listeners in Africa, maybe Isaac's listening, how can they get in contact with you?
The residency has a site called Moos, MOOS.garden, and the wider Moos has an events agenda. So if you're in Berlin, you can also check MOOS.space for events that are happening here.
Great. Thank you so much, and let's continue chatting.
Thank you for listening to the Worlding Podcast. Gefördert durch die Beauftragte der Bundesregierung für Kultur und Medien im Programm NEUSTART Kultur. Hilfsprogramm des Tanzen des Dachverband Tanz Deutschland.